Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Mao. Power and contradiction. Mao Zedong lived one of the most epic and influential lives of the 20th century. His impact on what became the People's Republic of China was vast, yet half a century after his passing, very few people will know much about the man. Hopefully we can address that balance because my next guest is Kerry Brown. No relation, by the way, but he's written a fact-finding and fascinating book. It's called Mao, Power and Contradiction. Delighted to say that Kerry joins us live on the line now. Good morning to you, sir.
Morning.
Whereabouts do we find you? Are you somewhere in the People's Republic, or are you somewhere a little more? I was going to say something, but where are you this morning, Kerry?
So I'm in the People's Republic of Kent, not
yes.
China, so a bit close to home.
So what's your background, and why are you so eminently qualified to write this particular biography of the great leader?
So, I didn't do Chinese origin at university. I did English under the late J.H. Prin, who only died last week at the age of 89. But he also had a link with China, though that wasn't something I was aware of when I was taught by him. I went to China first in 1991. I lived there for about 6 years, separately in Inner Mongolia. And then I was a British diplomat at the embassy in Beijing. And so I kind of knew people who had actually met Mao. It was still a sort of living memory, as it were. And I did my research on the Cultural Revolution, which Mao, of course, was the kind of presiding genius, if you want to call it, over. So I got to think about Mao quite a lot, as I say in the book, over the last almost 40 years. And this book is a kind of attempt to really try and sum that up in a relatively succinct way. One could write huge books about Mao. It's a very epic life.
Yeah, and indeed, the sweep of his life is quite incredible if you think about it. He's born the last decade of the 19th century. Trying to get my maths right, and the sort of the legend, if you like, that has been formed to him is that he's born of poor peasant stock, scrabbling in the ground. The thing with Mao is he kind of reinvents himself, or redescribes himself. So what is the background to Mao, and whereabouts is he born?
Yeah, so I've been to his birthplace in Hunan province, which is in sort of central China. He wasn't particularly poor in his background. His father was actually a small landlord. These were people that suffered badly when Mao came to power because they were called exploiters. Mao was a rebel from quite early on. He had a difficult relationship with his father, which I write about in the book. But his father died relatively young. His mother had a bigger influence on him, probably. He had a much closer relationship to her, and her death had a bigger impact on him. But Mao, you would say, was not someone who was from a kind of an uncomfortable background. And his house, well, it's been greatly restored and obviously is a bit of a shrine now. But it's certainly not a small place. He obviously had relatively, material means. Mao was also kind of taught at the very end of the Confucian education system, just before the imperial exams were phased out, I think in 1905. So he belongs to two worlds, the imperial world, but also the modern world. And that makes him very complex.
Indeed, the parallel with Stalin, hates his father, loves his mum, are quite. I think must be something in the water that you become a communist leader if that's your background. Interesting you say about the Confucian system, because Mao, at this time, it is the emperor, and if you've all seen the film The Last Emperor, that'll give you an idea. But it is China itself at that time is coming to the end of they don't know it, but it is coming to the end. China's got a huge bureaucracy, so everything is in order. Everything is supposed to be peaceful. Mao's got a sort of an arranged marriage because families are really important, and Mao sort of teaches himself lots of stuff. But he has a first wife, again, like Stalin, who he leaves because it's an arranged marriage, and he rails against that, doesn't he? He is, if you like, an angry young man, even from an early age.
Indeed, you could write a whole book about Mao Zedong's marital arrangements. He married 4 times, and his wives all had very different trajectories. The first wife, as you say, it was unconsummated. I think he married when he was not even a teenager, barely a teenager, and he was deeply unhappy with it. His second wife was actually killed by the nationalists, executed. His third wife was, kind of divorced. She ended up, kind of claims, in mental asylums both in Russia and China, but she lived until the 1980s. The final wife, Jiang Qing, was more long-lived. She was his wife from the end of the 30s until his death in 76, and she kind of had a political biography of her own during the Cultural Revolution. But yeah, you could say that Mao's private life, his inner life, was not straightforward. He was not a straightforward person. And we know a lot about this, largely because of an accident. His private doctor, Li Zhisui, left China in the kind of 1980s. No one really took much notice then, but he wrote a very complete account of the most intimate things about Mao's life. The authorities were very unhappy about this, but that gives us a real insight into what the inner world of Mao Zedong was like.
But also Mao is writing himself. I mean, he does put things down on paper or parchment. I mean, there's a famous thing where, in disgust about his marriage, because it is all structured in families, married families to strengthen the bonds, and this is obviously pre the revolution. I mean, he writes one bit saying that, because this is a time again that women are still coming to the end of it, still having their feet bound, for goodness sake. Which, if you've read Wild Swans, you will know, that is one of the appalling things. I mean, he writes that arranged marriages are basically, parents are sanctioning, and excuse me if you're just having a conflict, the rape of their children because of the way that this is structured. So it would seem that he is, and this is what's quite interesting as we get later on, he's pro women. When it finally comes, the People's Republic will be great for women. It turns out a little bit differently, but he is putting stuff down. He is having thoughts. He is writing. He starts writing, which obviously will become a huge influence on the Red Guards, the Cultural Revolution, etc.
Mao Zedong, you could argue, was a writer as much as he was a politician. I mean, he was a poet, and his poetry is well regarded, both in China and outside. I mean, he wrote a huge amount, often even during the depths of the wars, the Civil War, and then the war against the kind of Japanese. He was writing a huge amount. His collected works are still being produced. I mean, he was an extremely prolific writer and a good writer. I mean, a very knowledgeable writer. He was steeped in classical culture, even though he was antagonistic towards it. And you're right. Also, Mao, the feminist, you could write sort of quite a lot on that. It's a bit contradictory, because you wouldn't say that the system he set up was remotely kind towards women. But the first law that they passed was a marriage law allowing women in 1950 to divorce if they wished to, without the husbands kind of giving them permission. And, in many ways, Mao did empower Jiang Qing and women around him. But he also presided over a very male-dominated system. So it's a very mixed legacy there, too.
So if you sort of follow the official timeline, Mao decides to become a communist, and basically, everything is sort of bread and roses from that point onwards. But that isn't the truth. The Communist Party of China, as it begins as Mao, because he moves from his homeland to, Peking, Beijing, I don't know what we're calling it, or where does he move to get more involved with the communists?
So initially he moved to Beijing. He lived in Shanghai for a little bit. He was very sort of itinerant in a way. He kept on coming back to his home province, Changsha, Hunan province, and Changsha as the capital, largely because that was really a kind of hotbed of communist activity. You have to say the first phrases that Mao Zedong uses about communism and Marxism, Leninism in China were not particularly favorable. I mean, he converted maybe after a couple of years, largely because of influences of people like Chen Duxiu, like Beijing University, where he was working briefly.
Because he starts working in the library, doesn't it? He's a librarian, and that gives him the springboard. However, the Communist Party in China are very small. The Nationalist Party, and the yin to his yang, Chiang Kai-shek, is much, and they will have an absolutely titanic struggle, throughout their lives. They die within a year of each other, don't they? For those who don't know, give me, if you can, here we go, Kerry, sort of the 101, because they get the nationalists and the communists get together very quickly to fight off, because there's the Japanese get involved. We won't go into the horrendous detail of the rape of Nanking, but just if you can condense what kind of happens And obviously the wipeout of the communists in the cities, and then why it's seen as a countryside communist party. Off you go.
Well, I'll try. So, I mean, the Qing dynasty collapsed after about 260 years in 1911-12, and there was a ferment of ideas about this core question of what do we do to build a modern nation? Our last 100 years has been a disaster. We've been colonized, bullied. So there were many different perspectives. The nationalists were much more, they're kind of about building a great, powerful nation, building a great, powerful military, adopting some of the ideas that the Japanese had adopted to modernize their country in the late 19th century. The communists were much more radical. They said that the whole structure of society in China, there was something wrong. I mean, kind of exploitation, land owning, it was all land by only a few, land was owned by a few people. And these became the kind of main forces from the foundation of the Communist Party in 1921 in China. So by the mid-20s, you had the nationalists and the communists kind of sometimes briefly working with each other in order to achieve this nationalist dream of a great, powerful China, and then sometimes clashing and imploding. All of that continued until the mid-1930s, when the Japanese, increasingly assertive and increasingly wanting to exploit the massive territory of China, decided they would try and build their great co-prosperity region and annexed parts of China. The nationalists and the communists, therefore, had to unify because they were, in the end, trying to defend China's interests, even though they had different views of that. And they were kind of in that unified shape until the end of the war in 1945. So this whole history, you can see, is a sort of shift backwards and forwards. But the central question for Mao and for Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalists, and Sun Yat-sen, the father of Chinese nationalism, is what is China? What is the Chinese national consciousness? Who are we? And that question shapes all of that history.
And in the meantime, there's a small issue of the Soviet Union and Stalin. Now, Mao is a massive fan of Stalin, thinks he's the best thing since bread was sliced. And the main thing about the Soviet Union is the export of communists. So they send the combatant, don't they, over to train, and this is important, military and ideologically, as Moscow sort of things, these poor relations, these kind of backwards, because there's no proletariat in China. They've kind of been wiped out, especially in the urban regions, and that's because of what's called the White Terror, when Chiang Kai-shek basically liquidates thousands. But they are there, and they are helping, and they will basically provide a kind of lifeline for Mao. And again, Mao's not the leader at this point, is he? Not until basically the war, is he?
Yeah, I mean, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was enormously important, firstly because it had taken power in the revolutions in 1917, and secondly because it sent expertise, it sent money. So through the 1920s and 30s, without that, it's unlikely the Communist Party of China would survive. Mao Zedong was initially very supportive, but as he became a more significant leader, he started to articulate this vision of Chinese communism in a very specific way. No proletariat, no industrial cities, not really. Out of a population of 350 million, only probably 2 million working in cities, in industrial normal sectors. So finding the revolution in the countryside was what Mao was really about, agrarian revolution. That makes him very different. It was not orthodox Marxism. He made a big ideological change. You can start revolutions way before you have a proletariat with rural workers and rural revolutionaries. And those are the people that supported him in coming to power.
And they have to, because, he very nearly doesn't make it, because Chiang Kai-shek turns on him. The nationalists are doing well. As I said before, the White Terror liquidates thousands in the cities. So he flees to the country, and Chiang Kai-shek sort of starts Operation Extermination, and the clues in the name. They find, Mao and his followers find themselves surrounded, and they make a break for it. And this is the famous, it's the Long March, isn't it? 90,000 head out to Mao's rural base. And the losses on this, is chaotic. Luckily, the nationalists are also being supported, will be supported in the war by the states, because they see that as against Japanese expansionism. communism. But, the losses are horrendous. Mao's then wife gives birth, doesn't she? And they have to give up the child. I mean, it takes, a year? And of the 90,000 set out, only sort of 10,000 make it. They don't die. Many of them just think, okay, I'm going back to the country and sort of wander off. But the losses are horrendous.
Yeah, the 1920s and 1930s are kind of distinguished by huge levels of violence. Violence by the nationalists against the communists when they weren't getting on, and then increasingly from 1931 by the Japanese, and then full war from 1937. And so the Communist Party was really just a guerrilla group that was hiding. It was under threat from all sides. Mao Zedong, in his career, was famous for, accepting the role of violence in politics. You just have to use violence sometimes. Power grows from the barrel of a gun. That was his most famous statement. And so part of that was shaped by the fact that to survive, they had to use very radical methods. His first wife was executed, Yang Kai-hui. His second wife was executed, Yang Kai-hui, in the early 1930s. And so, he had personal experience of the trauma and the terrible violence used against people. And he himself was almost executed a couple of times. So when you think of when he came to power, this was not a man who had an easy route to power. And he was not going to be particularly merciful to anyone around him who crossed his path. Violence was really one of those difficult things about dealing with Mao and Maoism.
And what's interesting is after the Second World War ends and you have the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, Chiang Kai-shek basically goes, right, I'm losing. It turns out very quickly he doesn't get the American support that he was hoping for, even though they've been, beating off the Japanese or whatever. He flees to Taiwan with all the gold, and that, until the Korean War breaks out, Mao might have thought of invading Taiwan, but then Korea breaks out. Mao supports the North Koreans, so there's no way that they're going to let, Mao take Taiwan back to the Western Allies. But it becomes a very interesting period of time because obviously Stalin, shuffles off the mortal coil in 53. Mao is then basically the predominant leader of communism, trying to export it. And we have, now get my timeline, is it the Great Leap Forward first or the Cultural Revolution first? Or am I getting that the right way around?
Great Leap Forward first, yeah, that's right.
And that is what he tries to decide that China is now going to become an industrial nation. They start melting down metals and all sorts of things. And it goes basically a little bit bonkers, shall we say?
Yeah, things start to happen. Stalin had a dim view of communism in China, I have to say, and the way it developed. He called Chinese communists cave Marxists. He thought they weren't very primitive. So it was a strange relationship. However, you're right. Mao gave Stalin great face. He went to Russia twice, the only trips he really had abroad. And his view of Russia was, it was the first country that had had the revolution, so it had to be respected. In the 1950s, the party went from a party of revolution to a party in power and of governance. It was very, very different. And you would say that it was inheriting a country that was recovering from the trauma of international and domestic war. So very little infrastructure. I think the life expectancy in 1949, when the communists came to power, was 31 years. I mean, it was an incredibly devastated country. And really, there was a lot to rebuild. So the 1950s broadly were a time of reconstruction. But we started to see the Great Leap Forward and these other kind of political campaigns, which were well-meaning but very, very unrealistic. The Great Leap Forward in the 1957-58 was really to sort of produce an industrialized economy in 10 years. Well, in other places that had taken 50 to 100 years. So this was extremely ambitious, but Mao was trying to kind of basically push China as fast as possible towards this great nationalist goal of becoming again a great power that could be respected and could stand on its own feet.
But the problem is with that is the fact that because he's become supreme leader and everybody else is getting liquidated left, right and centre, nobody can go say to him, actually, you know that thing you're doing about, collective farming and all that sort of thing? Well, it's all very good exporting grain to sort of Soviet Union, whatever, but the people are starving in the fields. And indirectly, you can say that like millions die in the countryside, but those in the towns don't realise because people can't travel around and see that sort of thing. And obviously, there's no free press and whatever. So these policies, I mean, he sort of turns, the way that he and Stalin look at human life, individual human life, is barbaric and murderous, you could say.
So Mao famously made this comment, I think, to Japanese visitors some years later. It's sort of hard to trace down when it was first made, but it may even have been to sort of like Russian visitors that, well, the Americans can drop nuclear bombs on us, but if we lose, kind of a few million people or 200 million people, that's okay. We've still got loads of people left. So this gives the impression that Mao is very nonchalant about human life. And it is true. The famines in the early 60s, which were a result really of human error and poor policy, may have seen the deaths of from 30 to 40 million people, incalculable suffering. And that's the big difficulty about Mao. On the one hand, this real strong sense of China standing up and being proud and not being pushed around. So very, very popular, but also the enormous costs that he was willing to pay to achieve that. And people who tried to persuade him otherwise almost always ended up in a bad way. People who, like Peng Dehuai, who was a minister of defense, who had commanded the armies in the Korean War in the early 50s. Well, in the late 50s, he had a clash with Mao because he had been to the countryside and he had seen, these terrible scenes of starvation and problems. And he came back and in the most sort of tactful way said, we're not really kind of getting this right. We've got to rethink. And Mao took that as a direct threat. A famous thing called the Lunyi meeting in the late 50s, and basically had him removed from power in the Cultural Revolution a few years later, effectively persecuted to death.
Yeah, indeed. And then we have the idea that socialism can triumph over nature. And we have these wars. We have the war on local. We have the war on sparrows. What did the sparrows ever do to Mao? And of course, it is before the idea of environmental catastrophe. But this is an environmental catastrophe because if you kill the poor sparrows, that means that the insects and the plagues come. And again, we have total chaos.
Mao's view of the environment was very much, it was something to be conquered and overwhelmed by human agency. So he didn't really have a very kind view of the environment, disastrous environmental policies. And you're right, the kind of campaign to get rid of pests that included rats and, kind of insects and things, but it also included sparrows. And people would zealously go out and capture these poor things and kill them and suddenly realize that, well, if you kill them, then suddenly all the insects go through the roof because you're not having insects sort of eaten by, natural life. You're having to basically do all of this yourself. And so these were extremely ineffective policies. I think that there were a lot of other policies which you would say, like having what we call backyard kilns, where people would try and make their own steel. It's ridiculous. You would take scrap metal, you would try and melt it, and then create very poor quality stuff. So that's another example of these terrible.
And most of us will remember, because of our generation, Mao becomes this sort of cultural figure in the late 60s, early 70s, because we don't know what's going on. And we have the Cultural Revolution. This is the Red Guards. The only people who get this even more horrendously wrong are, you could say, the Khmer Rouge, because this is, you basically have, teenagers, the Red Guards. Mao, it's a cult of personality. Forget the family. The party will look after you. You've got teenagers running around in tanks. You've got humiliation of teachers. There's more, as you say, people are being encouraged to try and build their own nuclear reactors. It is mad. It's this whole cult of personality, and it's lucky that they can. Mao is now in his early 70s. What's your take on that particular one, Kerry?
Well, Mao was an enormously important cultural figure, and he was interested in culture. In a sense, he makes sense today. This is why, looking at Mao, you kind of see a lot of our politics today. If you want to do anything, you go for the culture first. And his argument was that Confucian culture was a burden, that it was always kind of holding people back, that they would never do anything else unless they were liberated from this 3,000 years of what he called feudal very oppressive, hierarchical Confucian culture. So I think that is understandable. Where it was implemented, though, was to try and use chaos, red guards, abandoning education. One famous student basically sat in an exam hall and basically ripped up his exam sheet, and that was regarded as being extremely good, and he was allowed to sort of become a model worker. There were enormous numbers of, teachers beaten up by their students. The young were kind of told it's right to rebel, and they were used as his shock troops. It's a little bit like Trump today. I mean, in a very different context, people have drawn this parallel that, Mao had this very pithy way of expressing things, not tweets, but he had the Little Red Book, which is a bit like Truth Social. He also appealed to people who were not necessarily part of the elite, who could kind of empower themselves, and basically take part in politics and not just leave it to the big wigs. So he is a very contemporary figure, and the Cultural Revolution, despite being 60 years old, this year, is still an incredibly kind of contemporary feeling movement. You mentioned the kind of attractiveness abroad. The Beatles, wrote Revolver. I can't remember, what was it, the Revolver or something? Revolution,
yeah.
Andy Warhol, with his famous images of Mao, Jean-Luc Godard, kind of did this ridiculous film called The Chinese with, sort of Parisian sort of models kind of spouting Maoist creed. And then finally, this sort of, I think it was Louis, this sort of kind of erotic magazine in Paris in the late 60s, had a model dressed up in a Maoist costume, basically saying to rebel is right. I mean, it's extraordinarily kind of, an interesting movement for outsiders, because it was about revolting against the system and the establishment, which of course was globally very popular and is popular now.
Yeah, and we go back to the revolts of 68. Now, I could talk to you about this until like next Wednesday, but I've only got a minute left. We didn't even get onto the mangoes, but there you go. Or indeed the fact that he apparently sets the world swimming record at one point in the Yangtze. He does, what is it? He does 15 kilometers in an hour apparently when he's 72. But the people will have to read the book. The book is called Mao, Power and Contradiction. It's by Kerry Brown. Listeners, go onto our virtual bookstore, click on the front cover. It'll be winging its way to you. Kerry, if people want to find out more about you, do you have social media? I mean, not Truth Social, but do you have a media platform? Are you on the web? Where can people find you?
I do. I mean, I tweet at BKerryChina, BKERRY China. And I'm easy to find at the King's College website with my other media and LinkedIn and places like that. So I'm very accessible.
We only sort of scratched the surface. Listeners, go forth and order the book. The book is called Mao, Power and Contradiction. It is by Kerry Brown, who we've been speaking to today. Kerry, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Thank you very much. Great to speak to you too.